Jacob returned home to find his family's century-old barn bulldozed by the HOA without warning. Their smug new president, Carl Whitmore, called it an eyesore and bragged about raising property values. But Jacob had something Carl didn't expect: military precision, legal knowledge, and land just outside HOA control. And just wait until you hear how a private shooting range turned the tables and delivered justice loud and clear. Jacob Miles rolled back into town on a quiet Sunday evening, dust still on his boots from the Veterans Fundraiser out in Custer County. It had been a good weekend: old stories, long hugs, names read aloud under the flag, and he was looking forward to a peaceful evening on his land. But as he turned down the familiar gravel road toward his property, something felt wrong. The outline of the horizon had changed. Where his grandfather's red barn used to rise proudly against the sunset, there was now just open sky. No roofline, no weathered cupola, just a flat stretch of gray dirt littered with splinters, bent nails, and what looked like a shattered rake sticking up like a grave marker. The sight hit Jacob like a punch to the chest. He pulled over, stepped out, and walked forward in silence. The barn was gone, completely leveled, not collapsed, bulldozed. All that remained was a warped wooden post with a laminated HOA tag fluttering from it like an afterthought. Property violation cleared per visual compliance ordinance, authorized by HOA board. The language was clinical, but the message was anything but. They hadn't left so much as a voicemail, no citation, no hearing, no chance to defend what had stood there for generations. Jacob stood amid the wreckage, like a man trying to recognize the bones of someone he once loved. This wasn't just any barn. This was the place where his father taught him how to shoot, where he fixed up the old Massey Ferguson tractor, where he found his granddad's Korean War medals hidden in a tin under the floorboards. It was the heart of the property, stained with oil, layered with dust, and sacred in all the ways that matter when you grow up on land your family built with their hands. And now it was gone. Later that evening, when Jacob made some calls and pressed for answers, he learned the new HOA president, Carl Whitmore, had personally authorized the demolition while Jacob was out of town. Carl had fast-tracked a visual compliance order under a bylaw nobody had heard of until now, claimed the barn clashed with the aesthetic cohesion of the neighborhood. Too rustic, too worn, too unrefined, as Carl reportedly said during the board meeting. Jacob had met Carl only once, a man with polished loafers, a spray tan, and a tight smile that never quite reached his eyes. Carl had moved in 2 years ago, bought one of the modern glass homes overlooking the HOA golf course, and immediately started pushing for tighter rules. No flags, no livestock, no visible clotheslines, and clearly no barns. Carl had always looked at Jacob's land like it was some kind of embarrassment to the HOA's vision of manicured perfection. But even Jacob hadn't expected this. This wasn't enforcement. This was a message. And as Jacob stood alone in the rubble, hands clenched and throat tight, one thought anchored in his mind like a steel spike. They wanted to erase his history. And they'd just made that mistake on the wrong man's land. Carl Whitmore hadn't wasted a single day after being elected HOA president. Backed by a thin majority of newly arrived homeowners, most of them retirees from out of state who liked the idea of country charm, but not the reality of it, he moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, the HOA newsletter doubled in size, enforcement patrols became routine, and a stack of new guidelines started making their way into residents' mailboxes. At first, Jacob ignored it, let them ban garden gnomes and bird feeders. His family's land sat on the edge of the neighborhood, partially shielded from the nonsense. The barn, the pond, the little patch of orchard, they were his corner of the world, untouched. Or so he thought. But Carl had a different vision. He didn't want a neighborhood. He wanted a brand. A modern country lifestyle experience, as he once described it during a board meeting. A curated postcard version of rural life, smooth roads, stone driveways, and symmetrical hedges. Anything aged or authentic. It had to go. Carl had taken one look at Jacob's barn, faded red paint, rusted hinges, crooked weather vane, and decided it didn't fit. Not with the new brochure designs he was commissioning, not with the weddings the HOA wanted to host at the clubhouse, not with the European minimalism aesthetic he quoted so often, as if he were managing a spa resort instead of a small-town HOA. And Jacob? He was just an inconvenience, a reminder that the land had a past before Carl showed up with his laminated vision boards and overpriced consultants. When Jacob walked into the monthly HOA meeting after the demolition, he wasn't there to shout. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice unless someone was in real danger. He just wanted to hear it from Carl's own mouth, why they thought they had the right. He didn't wait for the meeting to open. He stood at the back of the clubhouse and asked, calm as a dropped coin, "Who gave the order to bulldoze my barn?" Carl didn't even look startled. He smiled, the kind of smile a man wears when he's certain there's nothing you can do. That structure violated Section 9.3b of the updated compliance guide, Carl said, folding his hands like he was giving a lecture. It was visible from the community walking trail and did not conform to visual standards set by the board. Jacob stared at him in silence, waiting. Carl leaned back in his chair. "You should thank us," he added, his voice oily with self-satisfaction. "That thing was dragging down everyone's property values, and frankly, it looked like a storm could knock it over." No apology, no discussion, just a smug dismissal. He'd talked about the barn like it was a rotted fence post. Never mind that Jacob had offered to repaint it the year before, or that the structure was still sound, braced with steel beams his uncle welded in years ago. No mention of family, of history, of anything that mattered. Just community standards. And then Carl leaned in and delivered the final blow. "Things work differently now, Mr. Miles. This isn't the old county anymore. We're building something better." Jacob didn't say a word, didn't argue, didn't explain why that barn meant more than half the new homes in the subdivision. He just nodded once, slow, deliberate, and walked out of the room. He didn't slam the door, didn't speak to a soul. But that was the last time he attended a board meeting, the last time he opened a letter from the HOA. Instead, Jacob went home, and he started planning, not out of vengeance, but out of something deeper. A conviction forged from a quiet kind of fury, the kind that doesn't burn out, the kind that waits, that listens, that finds the one place no one thought to defend, and builds something no one can tear down. Not legally, anyway. While Carl Whitmore sipped his martinis and soaked in compliments from his inner circle, people more interested in curated landscaping than community, Jacob Miles was reading municipal codebooks. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't ranting on Facebook. He was in his shed with a lamp, a legal pad, and decades of quiet discipline kicking into gear. Jacob had spent his life doing things the hard, right way. He'd served 2 tours overseas as a weapons instructor, earned every stripe without cutting corners, and retired with commendations for restraint and professionalism. He wasn't about to stoop to vandalism or petty sabotage. He was going to do this legally, surgically, and loud enough that no one in that clubhouse would ever forget what they'd torn down. The piece of land where the barn once stood had an interesting advantage, something Carl and his board didn't know, or didn't bother checking. It sat just outside the HOA's enforceable boundary lines, protected under a county zoning map that hadn't been updated in over 20 years. Most people wouldn't even think twice about it, but Jacob had the original surveyor's maps, buried in a filing cabinet along with his father's military discharge papers. And that land? It backed directly up to the HOA's crown jewel, the freshly remodeled clubhouse. A modern, open-concept building with wide glass windows, pristine white trim, and a patio that hosted everything from wine tastings to board meetings. Jacob measured the distance from his property line to the edge of the clubhouse deck, 79 yards. Perfect. He started small, quiet, filed the necessary documentation to build a personal-use recreational structure, paid the permit fees, applied for the environmental sound impact study, submitted soil samples. He did it all by the book, no shortcuts, no red flags. And because of his spotless record, former service history, and certified firearms instructor license, the state board greenlit his application without a second glance. Within a week, trucks rolled in. He poured a thick concrete pad and reinforced it with shock-absorbing foam underneath. Soundproofing panels, rubber matting, berms stacked with earth and gravel. He installed a commercial-grade lead trap system and steel backstop rated for high-caliber rounds. There was no mistaking what he was building. A shooting range, private, legal, permanent. Neighbors started whispering. One or two stopped by, trying to make polite conversation, fishing for clues. Jacob just smiled, offered lemonade, and kept hammering. He didn't need to say a word. The truth would echo soon enough. And then, 3 weeks to the day after he broke ground, the first shot rang out. A clean, crisp crack of a .308 Winchester round tore through the still morning air like a fire alarm. Then another, spaced precisely, controlled, deliberate. The sound bounced off the manicured stucco walls of the clubhouse before rolling out across the HOA's walking trails and parking lot. Lawn chairs tipped. Cell phones came out. Someone dropped a latte on the tennis court. Jacob fired 5 more rounds before lowering his rifle and calmly writing in his logbook. It was all perfectly within regulation. Every round stayed within his boundary line. His firing lane was aimed at an angled berm, certified safe by a county inspector. There was no risk to life, no violation of code, just a thunderous, unmistakable reminder that while they'd torn down his past, they'd left his future wide open. And right now, his future sounded like thunder rolling across Carl's clubhouse patio. The HOA board scrambled to react. Calls were made, deputies arrived, but when they reviewed the paperwork and walked the property line with measuring wheels and county maps, they reached one conclusion: Jacob was absolutely within his rights. Just make sure you keep your hours posted and rounds below 90 decibels beyond the fence line, one deputy told him, clearly fighting back a smirk. Other than that, have a nice day, sir. Jacob didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice, but that afternoon he installed a professionally printed sign just inside the gate. Private range, veterans and law enforcement welcome, HOA membership not required, and beneath it, smaller, firing hours, sunrise to dusk, ear protection recommended. No one from the HOA came near his property after that. Not Carl, not his buddies, not even the groundskeeper. But Jacob? He kept showing up. Every Saturday, every holiday, every time the clubhouse hosted an event. He didn't aim at people. He didn't need to. He just reminded them over and over exactly whose land they were looking at. The first few days were chaos. Phones rang off the hook at the HOA office. Voicemails piled up. Complaints came in from startled residents, shaken brunchgoers, and golfers who weren't used to hearing anything louder than a leaf blower. Every call followed the same theme. There's a man firing a rifle behind the clubhouse. Do something? Carl tried. Oh, how he tried. He marched down to the sheriff's office with printed maps, legal jargon, and a stack of highlighted bylaws in a plastic binder. He demanded action, claimed it was a threat to community peace and a public nuisance. But the deputy on duty had already visited Jacob's range, had already walked the property line, checked the permits, and inspected the safety barriers. The deputy had just one line for Carl. As long as those rounds stay on his side of the fence, he's within his rights. Carl left red-faced and empty-handed. Meanwhile, Jacob never said a word. He didn't need to. He simply posted official firing hours on a neat wooden sign at the edge of his range. Monday, Saturday. 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., closed Sundays. Special holiday sessions, noon to 2 p.m. He mowed the grass around it, kept the area spotless, and once a week, like clockwork, a few off-duty sheriff's deputies joined him for the target drills. They brought their own gear, left their phones in their trucks, and each time they thanked Jacob on their way out. It didn't take long for the clubhouse to fall quiet. Carl's curated social calendar dried up. No more outdoor luncheons, no wine tastings. The once coveted patio space became a ghost zone, too loud, too unpredictable, too close to Jacob's lesson in consequences. By the time the next HOA election came around, Carl's carefully built image had collapsed. The members he once wooed with promises of modern community refinement now saw him as the man who triggered a permanent firing range behind their clubhouse. They didn't yell at him. They simply voted unanimously. Carl was out. His allies followed within the month. The new board president, an older woman named Susan, who had lived in the neighborhood since Jacob was a boy, requested a private meeting. She brought homemade cornbread and a handwritten apology signed by all 7 board members. They offered to pay for a new barn, offered to cover labor, materials, even historical restoration work. Jacob thanked her, politely, firmly, and declined. "I don't need another barn," he said. "That one stood long enough to teach me everything I needed." Instead, Jacob dismantled the shooting bench and built a gazebo in its place. Nothing extravagant, just a solid wooden structure with a shaded roof, a bench swing, and a clear view of the old clubhouse lawn. He planted 2 oak trees beside it, left a folded American flag in a glass case on the back wall, right above the spot where the first round had once been fired. These days, Jacob rarely uses the range. But on Memorial Day, the 4th of July, and the occasional crisp fall afternoon, neighbors hear a few deliberate shots ring out, measured, clean, unmistakable. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but as a reminder that history matters, that land remembers, and that no one bulldozes a man's legacy without expecting the echo